So we're having two panel discussions today, and the first one is this one on AE and friendships, and the second one will be on AE and his poetry and art. So first of all, just to introduce the panel. So they probably shouldn't need any introduction at this stage, but we've got Patrick O'Donnell here, Dr. Patrick O'Donnell. He's a professor of English at Normandale College in Minneapolis, Minnesota, USA. He's also the Director of Education at Catholic Junction Art Centre. He's an Irish Studies writer, editor, a literary historian and a scholar. So Patrick is going to be talking about James Stephens. We've got Réamonn Ó Ciaráin, who is CEO of Gael. He's a Gaelic scholar and an expert on Irish mythology. He's also author of 3 books on Cuchulainn. And Réamonn's going to be talking about Standish and Brady. We're also joined by the friends of our society, Dorothea McDowell and Linda Rosewood. So Dorothea and Linda are both great enthusiasts of Ella Young. Dorothea is a biographer of Ella Young, and both Dorothea and Linda have been working on a script, which is just finished. It's a play called Halcyon Days about Ella's life in California. And she's also mentioned they're looking for some backing for that. They've also published a book of transcripts about by Ella Young's friends, and it's called Ella Young Remembered. So thanks very much. Who wants to go first?
So James Stephens.
Okay.
I'll get your PowerPoint up there, Patrick.
Right. So I'll just move out of the way. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, I'm talking about AE's friendships. I'll just talk about 10 minutes or so. I'll go through this relatively quickly. So AE at its peak was the editor of the Irish Homestead in Plunkett House. We were over there yesterday. The Irish Homestead had published James Joyce under the name Stephen Dedalus. It was then edited by A.F. Norman, but A had helped Norman recognize Joyce's genius and got 3 of the stories that eventually become the first 3 stories in Dubliners published in the Irish Homestead. The other great friendship he makes is with James Stephens. So Stephens' birth is interesting. And also it's similar to Stephen Dedalus, James Joyce, Stephen Dedalus, James Stephens, and Stephens had a kind of a spiritual kind of affinity to Joyce. The scholars think he's probably born in 1880. He said himself that he was born on February 2nd, 1882. Those of you who know Irish literary history know that that's James Joyce's birthday. So he aligns himself with James Joyce. Joyce published Ulysses on his 40th birthday. But James Stephens is one of these. Now he's kind of well known to, if you read Irish literature, but he's one of these sort of sunken giants a little bit, I think myself, in Irish literary history. A brilliant figure, poet, fabulous novelist, man of letters. His creative brilliance flourished under the influence of A.E. So he starts off as he was a very diminutive, small gentleman with a very large, gnome-like head. And one of the images he uses is the leprechaun in his book, The Crock of Gold, which I'm going to talk about a little bit as you keep going there. Thank you. So A.E. Russell is at his peak when he befriends James Stephens. So James Stephens is initially recognized by Arthur Griffith, and is writing for the United Irishmen and later Sinn Féin. But he comes into the circle of A.E. He's invited out to they used to call them at-homes, meaning that the artist or the writer will be at home. But they were basically literary cultural salons. At 17 Rathgar Avenue is the kind of the core peak address in the salon culture of the Irish literary renaissance from when Russell moved in there in 1906 and 1907. So A.E. Russell is, he's about 20 years older than James Stephens when he meets him. He is the model of the philosopher. So as James Stephens, who came out of kind of poverty, we're not quite sure if he was an orphan or he was abandoned by his parents, he has a very poignant description of as a child. Remember, he's very little, small, little, diminutive little guy, fighting for a crust of bread with a dog. No matter how hard your life has been, I don't think you've fought for a crust of bread off a dog. And so James Stephens comes into this glittering, brilliant world of conversation, of artists, of A at this point is very mature intellectual framework, mysticism, he's been reading mysticism, he's practicing as a mystic, and he becomes the figure of the philosopher, first in the articles, and then later the philosopher in the Crock of Gold. It was an extraordinary work. I remember reading it as a child, thinking it was just about leprechauns and it was kind of silly whimsy. I recently reread it. It is a very profound statement in fantasy form of the planes of consciousness, occult philosophy, of theosophy. A very sophisticated philosophy is put into this comic novel Fantasia. And I highly recommend reading it. It's an extraordinary novel.
Air conditioning?
Oh, run off air conditioning.
Oh, right, okay.
What am I supposed to do?
Well, this one here.
Yeah.
Technology.
Like support.
Very good. Okay, you want to keep going? I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to go over it for just if anybody is not very familiar with AE's life, I'm just going to go over it very quickly and then kind of put James Stephens into the four phases of creative life. So he was born in 1867 in Lurgan. The family comes up in 1878 to Dublin. Basically, his creativity begins in this 1884 to 1897. Begins with mystical visions. He is having mystical visions himself, particularly he gives account of this in Armagh. Also, when he's walking up in the Dublin mountains, he has encounters of the largeness of the cosmic picture. He then, as he meets Charles Johnson of W.B. Yeats, he starts to study theosophy, and he starts to weave together the occult revival around Madame Blavatsky, which is a big international movement that impacts American, British, Irish, European culture. It's a huge movement. Blavatsky is sort of the spearhead, but that gets woven into the rediscovery of Celtic consciousness. We get this fantastic weaving together of the Irish literary revival. It's when he starts to write poetry, he starts to write fiction, he starts to write prose. I'll just cover that briefly. That's the first phase. He's done 12 years of mystical study up to 1897. This is when he joins the Irish Agricultural Organisation Society. After Yeats encourages Plunkett to interview him. And then the next year he marries Violet North, who was also a theosophist that he met at Ely House. So the next phase, then very quickly, is he gets married, starts having children, marriage, family, works for Sir Horace Plunkett's Irish Agricultural Organisation Society, and then becomes a mentor to poets and dramatists. That takes us up to about 1905. This is when he's meeting Padraig Colum, encouraging Padraig Colum is another one of his friendships. He's in and out of a very close correspondence with W.B. Yeats through this period. Yeats is off pursuing Maud Gonne and the Golden Dawn in London. So, but he's establishing himself. Basically, the metamorphosis in A.E. is a shy dreamer, uncertain of himself, becomes more self-assured, more confident, more focused, more aware, more of a personage, a person of substance who can emanate a kind of a spiritual energy that people pick up on and are inspired by. So this is why he's called the luminous center of the Irish literary revival. He's the one shedding light. He's like the beacon. He's the sage. He's the guru. Now, after this point here, from 1905 to 1920, he starts to get his mind. So where am I? No, after this point, from 1905 to 1920, he becomes an editor of the Irish Homestead. Becomes a thought leader for the Irish Homestead. On a weekly basis, is helping produce this magazine. This is when he meets James Stephens. This is when he moves to 17 Rathgar Avenue. This is where he has a hub where we get all kinds of accounts of people visiting. Now, he'd been holding at-homes before this. Joyce had met him in 1902 when he lived in Colson Avenue in Rathgar. But once he moves into 17 Rathgar Avenue, he gets the hub. And James Stephens is a regular attendee at these at-homes and Sunday nights. Now, in literary Dublin, you could go, depending on the writer, you could go from practically Monday through Sunday to at-homes for various kinds of, some of them would be more philosophical, some of them would be artists, some of them would be literary. A.E. was kind of all of it. He was like an editor, philosopher, writer, painter. So many, many different voices would sit and talk for many hours in Rathgar Avenue. One of the figures here is James Stephens, who becomes a brilliant conversationalist with himself. He kind of learns theosophy. His poetry is full of theosophy. His poetry is not studied enough, but it's full of theosophy. And he acknowledges A.E. as a crucial influence. The last little chunk here is, this is when he becomes, the end of James Joyce's portrait of the artist. Stephen Della says, I go for the millionth time to encounter for the reality of experiences, to seek the uncreated conscience of my race. And I think this is when A.E. is the creative conscience of the Irish race at this point. from 1920 to 1935. Here he's editing the Irish Statesman. He's an editor, thought leader, conscience of the nation, novelist, poet, sage, universal pundit, international speaker, and advocate for a more cosmopolitan, listen to this, advocate for a more cosmopolitan and sophisticated Ireland as editor of the Irish Statesman. I think the Ireland we walked through to get here is more cosmopolitan and sophisticated. I would tentatively suggest that he dies in 1935. So that's just a big picture. And we can elaborate this in great detail, just a big overview. In comes James Stephens. 1912 for James Stephens, two masterpieces, The Charwoman's Daughter and the absolute comic masterpiece, which contains in this comedic, parodic form this mystical philosophy when you read it. It actually bursts off the page when you read it. You think you're reading this little tale about leprechauns and philosopher in the woods, but he opens it up into a journey into the gods and into the mythological and into the mystical planes of consciousness, while still maintaining the fact that, oh, you're just reading an entertaining comic fable. Absolutely extraordinary little gem of a book. Go ahead. So, he's discovered by, I'll cover this quickly. So, but he was born in 1880 or February 1882. Hunger is one of the themes when you read The Crock of Gold. He lived in poverty, hunger, but he had a tremendous intellect which flowered under the influence of A.E. So he was sometimes called the leprechaun. So a leprechaun is kind of a soul image for himself. The leprechauns lose the crock of gold in the Crock of Gold, and then at the end they recover it. So there's sort of a quest element in the novel. You want to go ahead, next one? So he's the luminous center. Makes it sound like he's a little radioactive. That's amazing. A spiritual luminary. So the major career turning point and influence from the literary revival is this 1905 to 1923 when A edits the Irish Homestead. That's like a counterweight to the opening of the Abbey. Sometimes Irish literary history is hijacked by the Yeatsian art, the Yeatsian story, which is all Abbey theatre, the drama. But there's more going on than just the founding of the Abbey. There's also the thought leadership of A.E. So we need to slightly rebalance that narrative and bring A.E. more into it. The Russell family moved into Rathgar Avenue in 1906. He's there until 1933. This is the premier salon. James Stephens gets his start with the great Arthur Griffith, hugely important figure. I'm just going to mention it really briefly. A great friend of Michael Collins, and he dies in 1922. But his Sinn Féin starts to publish articles by Stephens. This is where A reads his work and starts to pick up a little bit on his. He starts seeing this guy could be a genius, this Stephens. And so he goes, it was in Marion Square as a clerk, and he tracks him down in Marion Square and says, I'm looking for a guy called James Stephens, and this little head emerges above a typewriter, and he says, Stephens famously says, I am he, the beginning of the genius of James Stephens. Okay? Because it's the meeting with A.E. And A.E. becomes a kind of a surrogate father. This guy is he an orphan? We're not quite, very disturbed family background, but the surrogate father, philosopher, sage is A.E. Next there, please. Okay, friendship with James Stephens. So the always reliably gossipy, horrendously, sulfurically acidic, but hugely entertaining George Moore. The Brie Crew Niamh Changa, the Irish archetype of the Brie Crew of the poison tongue. This is the poison tongue, malicious, but hugely entertaining. I highly recommend you read George Moore, a fascinating figure. But in his great memoir, which A is a huge part, he relates how George Russell looked for a rival to Yeats's discovery. Sing dies in 1909 after a meteoric career with the Abbey. So where did you find him in Arthur Griffith's paper? And this is like, look at this nasty little cynical account, but it's just brilliantly entertaining. I just love it. He says, there follows Moore's description of A's journey to Macready's office in Marion Square. And the surprise when two great brown eyes looked up from the typewriter and the clerk said, and says, I am he. So then he comes out to Rathgar. Next one, please. So the friendship, so as the inspiration, so A.E., when you read The Crock of Gold, there are two philosophers. If you've read this we usually read this when we're kids in Ireland, but if you read this, you remember there's two philosophers, and then one of them gets tired. Their conversation is droning like a bee in the hive. So they get tired of their philosophical disputes, the two philosophers, and the first philosopher famously spins himself out of existence. Brilliant description. And then his wife, realizing the philosopher husband is gone, she spins herself out of existence. There's a very trippy, cosmic, phantasmagoric description. Wonderful stuff. So A begins to appear initially as the old philosopher in the articles, and then these are versions of the Rathgar salons. So they're studies of his pontifications. So the old philosopher discourses on, again, this is like what we saw in the Irish Homestead. Some of the topics are on butter. So this mystical philosopher has also practical realities. So Stephens points out he's talking about washing, politeness, smoking. The brilliance of the old philosopher's discourses from whence. Now, this is where the philosopher and the Crock of Gold was to originate. They appeared about twice a month from January 2009. And then there's another collection of prose called Here Are Ladies, but then the masterpiece is the Crock of Gold, and this is the scholar, historian Pyle, her study of Stevens. So I'll just wrap up with a couple more really quickly. So A.E. needed both friendship and opposition from writers like Yeats, Moore, and later James Stephens. He also gathered around him a circle of young men and women who were just discovering the pleasure of putting words together, including Ella Young, who we'll hear about in a moment. For these poets in the making, he was prophet, schoolmaster, and companion. Right? So from 1909, he's friends with James Stephens. So he searches out the writer, finds a little known man. The poverty-stricken James Stephens is now a prominent guest. And so Stephens, to me, is one of these quintessentially Irish writers. His wit, his trickery, his playfulness, his scholarship, his self-taught. He's an autodidact. His autodidact quality of scholarship. He's tremendously learned he studied the Irish language, Irish folklore, mythology, and sort of self-taught. You know, some of the best Irish writers never went to university. They're these self-taught. It's that Irish tradition of I will know more than anybody and become creative, like Patrick Kavanagh and these other figures. Right? So the gift of fantastic humor bubbled over, and his whimsical talk and writing seemed to match the jerking and twitching of his diminutive body. He thought for a while he would be an acrobat and work in the circus. So he's an interesting guy, James Stephens. Go ahead. So and again, A.E. delighted in the fanciful, richly human world. His poetry praised him for speaking, and like most writers, for the whole man, body, and soul. The relationship between writers grew very close, and Stephens soon found himself drawn deeply into the study of Indian mysticism. Padraig Colum was in A.E.'s Deirdre, and A.E. would play the Druid. He recalled that they both lived in the same part of Dublin, walking home from rehearsals with A.E. Padraig Colum was like a clerk. He was starting to hear all about the Bhagavad Gita. And similarly, James Stephens, who was a clerk, is suddenly saturated in Oriental wisdom. And that's a crucial energy behind the Irish literary revival, the openness to Eastern wisdom. Go ahead. So again, he advocated for Indian wisdom. He thought that would deepen the character, and then he regarded him as his best friend, and finding him irreplaceable during the long periods when he lived abroad. James Stephens moved to his wife liked to move to France, so he was in France a lot. He got to know James Joyce better in France, and he tended to blame Mrs. Stephens for going abroad. Go ahead. That's it, very good. Okay, so just a couple of things. Now James Stephens eventually leaves Ireland and moves to London, and he broadcasts for the BBC, and I'll just wrap up these comments. So there's transcripts of these great radio broadcasts. So he's in the 1940s, 1942, during the war, and he's remembering A.E. So some of the accounts we have that make A.E. so interesting is what did his friends think of him, right? And he says the following. He says that of all of the remarkable men that I met, sorry, here it is. Sorry. It's better if I don't look at papers and just talk on top of my head. Anyway. He said of all the remarkable, he says, George Russell was from 20 to 25 years my senior. He says, A.E., so this is a radio broadcast, he says, was the most remarkable man I have ever known. The young man he was, what? Alarming, inspiring, astonishing. He was professionally a seer, a painter, a poet, an essayist, a journalist, an economist, and with one exception, he was the greatest conversationalist I have ever met. The exception was Stephen McKenna, the translator of Plotinus. He was another great figure. In the Crock of Gold, I'll just briefly mention this because I've got to wrap up. The following axioms, which are part of the worldview of A.E.'s mystical philosophy, are expressed in there's basically a conflict between two gods of the Crock of Gold. Pan, the Greek god of natural sexuality, comes and sort of releases the sexuality, particularly of the women of Ireland. And then there's a counter figure of the love poet and the poet of romance, who is Angus Og. And Angus Og basically drives out Pan and argues for the divine imagination. Not just looking at things in terms of the physical body, but looking at the divine imagination. The journey of the philosopher in the novel is from being lost in otherworldly speculation, not appreciating his wife or his children, having to go on a journey where he basically comes down into unifying the head and the heart into a mystical unity, and aligning himself as a philosopher with the ideas spoken by Angus Og, the god of the divine imagination and love. And Angus Og has the birds, remember the birds which are his kisses, whirling around his head. So it's like a higher form of love than just the physical, sensual love of Pan. In the novel Kilmashoke, which we know that A used to go on hikes up to, is one of the reference points for the old philosophers. So you can if you want to know A better, simply read a little comic novel called The Crock of Gold. He's right in the heart of it as the philosopher, and the mystical philosophy that can sound so remote is expressed in a brilliantly witty, very Irish, trickster-like comic form in The Crock of Gold. All right, thank you very much for your attention.
Guricéad maigid a fáideach bhí sin thart spéisiúil agus a chairde chéan ag go leabhairt Standish James O'Grady, not to be confused with Standish Hayes O'Grady, the cousin, and in particular the reason why I'm going to speak about Standish James O'Grady is that A.E. himself tells us that the book that most influenced him was Standish James O'Grady's The Coming of Cuchulainn, which is a book I have listened to many, many times and read. And I just want to say that when I think of A.E., and I'm in mortal danger of boring everybody at this stage, I always think of this line here: is there a centre within us through which all the threads of the universe are drawn? I believe that that is the central question that A.E. succeeded in answering, and our panel today is discussing A.E. and his friendships. And before I talk about Standish James O'Grady, I think for A.E., people didn't have to actually meet in the same room to be his friend. I have a feeling that A.E. communed with this individual here, Patanjali, who wrote or developed the sutras or committed them to book form, and you can see he was a sage from the 2nd century BC and lived a long life, or we can't determine his actual age. Another person or concept that I think would be in that territory of a friendship of A.E. is Manannán mac Lir.
Yeah.
But I think it's Manannán's father, Lir, and a lot of people will say Lear, and they'd be wrong, because it's Lir and not Lear. Lear is an English word to look at somebody in a nasty kind of unwanted way. Lir. And Lir, who had the son Manannán mac Lir, who rode across the seas on his chariot, pulled by these mystical horses. The father is Lir, and he A.E. equated to source. Think of the fathomless oceans that this island has been dropped into, and that's this huge source of everything that A.E. thought of when he thought of where it all began. Lir. And John Moriarty also talks about Lir as this vast source of ether or whatever it is, dark matter. Lir. We had it long before quantum physics had it. Lir. Some other friends, James Connolly. I'm not going to go into his friendship with A.E. here and now, but we know that A.E. thought a lot of James Connolly, and the feeling was mutual, and James Connolly invested a lot of of faith in AE, especially when he was executed. And in the middle, we heard much mention of H.B. Blavatsky yesterday. They didn't meet, to my knowledge, either in London or here, but as we have already mentioned, you don't have to meet everybody. I didn't meet William Blake, I didn't meet John Moriarty, but they have taken up a lot of space in my head. Thankfully, I'm not charging them any rent, I want them there. And this gentleman here, Patrick mentioned him earlier on, Walt Whitman seems to have influenced AE, especially with his connection with the earth and moving away from the industrial age. And other friends that AE had and with whom he communed regularly up in Creesha would have been the fairies that Jenny spoke so eloquently about yesterday. And you know, who were the fairies, who were the little people, who were the wee people? Well, I think that our people looked upon those who have gone before us as the wee people, the good people, the Tuatha De Danann, and you know, the Unlocked She is another name from them. And even in the Irish Gaelic wisdom, we speak about when you die, you go Erchli na Firinne, on the great journey of truth, and Slua na Marav. You join Slua na Marav, the host of the dead, who are these creatures, ideas, concepts, spirits that AE drew. And this brings me to Standish James O'Grady, who was a unionist, but also a nationalist. Lady Gregory called him a Fenian unionist, and you know, he studied at Trinity down the road here. He studied history, but he really didn't like the way that he learned history in the conventional way, because he believed that history was drawing him into this vortex of just dealing with fact and artifacts, whereas he believed that you could take ideas from mythology and recreate the story of Ireland, which he did in 2 volumes, and then the coming of Cuchulainn in a very meaningful way, creating his own style of language to retell the story of Cuchulainn. I listen to the book a lot when I'm out driving, and it's a very powerful retelling of the story of our national hero, our greatest hero, Cuchulainn, who has taken up place down in the GPO in Oliver Shepherd's statue. And I heard recently that somebody said, who is this guy here? Was that one of your first postmen? So, just briefly, Owen McNeill, and I am actually going to speed up. I'm going to put my foot on the accelerator here because we've 2 more presentations after this panel. But Owen McNeill, this is very interesting. Owen McNeill blamed, Owen McNeill of the Counterman, by the way, blamed O'Grady, Standish James O'Grady, for infecting Pearse with an unhistorical and pagan imagery regarding heroism. Now, in 1916, in the post office at the other end of O'Connell Street, AE believed that there was an additional warrior in the corridors, and that additional warrior was Cuchulainn. Pearse thought of these ideas, concepts, spirits in the same way as A.E. did. You know, they didn't have to manifest physically, because they could manifest in an even more powerful way. And Yeats put it into his poem statues when Pearse summoned Cuchulainn to his side. What stalked through the corridors of the post office? So, what stalked through the corridors of the post office? Well, it was in Croke Park yesterday when Armagh plugged into that Cuchulainn-esque power and defeated the aristocracy of Gaelic football. And we all reach a point in our lives for a variety of reasons when, as Patrick mentioned earlier on today, we need to find our inner hero. Joseph Campbell talked about this. You know, find your bliss. Your bliss is when you access your inner hero. You all have it. It speaks to you several times in your life, but we're all too busy to hear the soft, small inner voice. But A.E. heard it, Pearse heard it, and Standish James O'Grady give voice to this inner national hero in his description of Cuchulainn, his growing up, his exploits, and his great heroic deed, standing on Tipping's Rock, holding back the advance of the other four provinces of Ireland, because there were 5 provinces at that time, trying to come to Ulster and steal the prized bull, the brown bull of Cooley. Maeve wanted that brown bull of Cooley not to equal her white-horned cow, but so that, her husband's white-horned cow, but that the brown bull of Cooley would savagely defeat and kill her husband's bull, so that she would be superior. But Cuchulainn stood and held back the advance, and Standish James O'Grady described this very eloquently with a language that he devised himself, which is amazing. It's powerful. You really should, if you're not going to read his book on Cuchulainn, which deeply moved A.E. Russell, listen to it. It's on audible.com. And so just Standish James O'Grady was a Cork man, and like A.E., he died outside Ireland. He died on the Isle of Wight. He was about 21 years senior to A.E. Russell, and many of you will know that one day A.E. was parading on the promenade in Bray, and for some reason he was moved to jump up on a wall and expound about Gaelic wisdom and this extra dimension to life and art that he wanted to convey. And the surprising thing is, who happened to be there to hear him? Only Standish James O'Grady, and he was impressed. But Standish James O'Grady was not entirely impressed with AE because when AE's play Deirdre of the Sorrows, that is, but the play is called Deirdre, was performed at the Abbey, Standish James O'Grady got in contact with AE to say that he was very let down by AE for parading these great heroic gods like Cuchulainn on the stage, and that sort of belittled how important they were. So O'Grady was influenced by James Macpherson's romantic retelling of the Oceanic lays and legends, and he played a formative role, even though I've misspelled that, a formative role in the Gaelic Celtic revival, and so much so that he was known as the father of the Celtic revival. And you know, from O'Grady, A.E. received an insight into ancient Ireland, and we get this notion, and Yeats put it well, that ancient Ireland knew it all, and I believe that it knew a lot. You know, it definitely knew a lot, and we're sort of finally catching up to some of the wisdom that our ancients knew and celebrated, rituals being one of them. And I'm speeding up here. Interestingly, A.E.'s favourite part of Standish O'Grady's retelling of the Cuchulainn story was when Cuchulainn fought his friend and foster brother Ferdia at the whereabouts of Ardee today. And the part that he particularly liked about this, which does not ever happen in modern day warfare at all. Modern day warfare is all about pulverizing your enemy and getting more and more powerful weapons to vaporize your opponents. A.E. loved when Cuchulainn, he didn't want to fight his best friend, his foster brother Ferdy, but that's the way things, circumstances had contrived to bring them together in mortal and prolonged battle. But the battle lasted for 3 days. They were hacking at each other. Each day they had to go for sharper and longer and more dangerous weapons to finish things off, so that it would be more conclusive. But each night they separated with 3 kisses. Their horses grazed the same grass. Their entourage shared medicines between the 2 combatants, and then they started the next day. That would not happen in modern day warfare now, sadly. It would be more like bomb the hospitals that are treating the combatants. This is a programme of A.E.'s play Deirdre. You can see one of the Fay brothers, was there playing a central role, and I'm just going to.
Approach to history of the grain string, Standish O'Grady, to learn more about that, and that's for another day. The writing of history.
Indeed, he had a very novel approach to it. And because time is against me, I'm just going to finish with a photograph. And we have heard AE's voice at the festival in Armagh, and I am pleased to say that despite spending most of his life here in Dublin, he retained his Lurgan accent. It was almost something like, I am George Russell, and most better known as AE. I would have thought him as a big, booming man, but he has a very fine voice and a very Armagh accent, for my money. Thank you very much.
So I'm Linda Rosewood, and this is my friend, Dorothea McDowell. And Dorothea and I have had hours and hours of conversations about Ella Young, one of AE's entourage and friend and former friend. So we thought that we might just have a conversation, and sometimes I ask Dorothea questions and she says, page 37 in my book. And sometimes I ask you a question that you're not quite ready to hear. And so that may happen too, so we'll just see what happens. I think you've seen the questions, but yeah, you might get surprised. So, so just to begin, Dorothea got me interested. I often call her Ella, actually, because she says that she is Ella Young. Dorothea got me involved in her project to promote the life and legacy of Ella Young a couple of years ago. And we have a webpage, ellayoung.org, and there's lots of material there, including a talk that we gave at the AE Festival in April, if you're interested. So, but we're just going to focus right now on their relationship. I think that AE made key contributions to her life. Do you think?
He was our mentor.
Yeah, he was her mentor. Right. Okay. I don't know if I want to go through the biography.
No,
Let's just
no.
dig into the. So she wrote a book called Flowering Dusk. It's an episodic memoir that, because of Dorothea's research, we're going to be able to publish that sometime later this year. James and Sally North are publishing it around September, we hope.
Yeah.
And at our other talk, we read about the night that she met AE, but Dorothea is now going to read about going to visit the Hermetic Society. That would have been a few years later.
Yeah, they broke away from the...
Yeah. So, do you mind reading that one scene?
Okay. There has been a split in the Theosophical Society. AE, followed by all the young writers and poets, has denounced Mrs. Dingley. The house in Eli Place has shut its doors against us. We call ourselves the Hermetic Society, and we meet in a room found, after much searching, in a house empty but for ourselves. One climbs 2 flights of stairs to reach it. First one has to find the stairs. Newcomers search for a long while before discovering the blind alley and the dusty entrance to the half-deserted house, whence those stairs led up to the deserted room. Tallow candles lighted, it is full of shadows and dust. The members are supposed to clean it up now and again, but they don't think of it very often. A fire burned in the grate when anyone remembers to bring sods of turf. Opening dimly from that first room is a second dignified with the title of library. It has much emptiness and a few books and pamphlets. In contrast, the walls of the chief room are covered with papers, more or less securely pinned there. Close inspection discovers them to be sonnets and lyrics in the handwriting of the authors. There are questions and replies in verse, mock serious criticisms and compliments. Neatly written on a large piece of paper is a query which purports to come from Helen Lurd, though in reality AE wrote it in a spirit of mischief. It begins, "Dear God, I wonder if you've heard of me. My name is Helen Lurd," and goes on to complain that in the Hermetic, everyone has a different idea of God, and it's hard for a beginner to choose. I wish I could remember this masterpiece, but unfortunately I can only recall a verse referring to myself. My sister Ella takes a view of God, a territorial sort of view. I think an island is her notion, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. James O'Sullivan, slender and graceful, brings in lyrics which he is too shy to read. James Connolly, the other James, it's another James Connolly, has a fine sonnet about a ship. Corey Cullen is concerned with ballad poetry. A.E. lectures on occultism every Thursday evening. And when the lecture is over, he discusses poetry and criticizes the work of his young poets. He thinks it would be possible to collect enough material for a small book of verse, with a foreword from him if he could find a publisher. At times we persuade A.E. to recite his own poetry. He does so in a rich chanting voice. Sound, he insists, is one of the great things in poetry. Keats and Shelley, he praises. Swinburne, he does not mention.
The book is full of really funny little anecdotes like that, as well as lyrical poetry, and I can't wait to make it more available to people. So they did publish that book.
Which book?
The poetry. Like A.E. brought together his friends.
Yeah.
So they published that book.
Yates called them the Canary Bird.
Yeah, well,
Voices of Friends, wasn't it, or something?
Huh?
it's called New Songs.
New Songs.
And it was published in 1904.
Yeah.
And I thought that it was mostly young people, but Ella,
No.
but it wasn't. No, but Ella and
Ella were
yeah,
young,
yeah. I mean, they were the same age.
Yeah.
Most of them were in their 30s, though. I wouldn't consider that young, but I don't think Ella really talked about her own poetry in her memoir.
No.
Why do you think that was?
Well, I don't know.
No, it's just, this seems odd because she was known
As a poet.
as a poet, and she was, she came to parties and read her poetry out loud, and people could. We discovered a sheet music for a song that was composed for her to read one of her poems over, and that's
Harry
one
Barch,
of the,
yeah.
well, that's one of the things we're going to bring out. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Kilmashogue.
Oh God, yeah.
So, we know that, A.E. brought his friends to Kilmashogue on vision quests,
And so did Ella.
but then so did Ella. Do you think their experiences were the same or different? Or?
Everybody's experience is different. We're all
Have you ever
individual.
been up there?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Dublin, so yeah, of course. Yeah. I didn't cycle up there.
What was did you have extra normal
No, I
experiences?
was a very practical person,
Okay,
living in the world.
okay. So, I know that you are Ella.
Yeah.
But you are a very practical person living in the world. Like, you don't seem like an airy-fairy kind of person to me.
No.
So you've never seen one of the good people then?
No.
But you've been to Kilmashogue.
Yeah.
What was it like?
It's a mountain. I mean, I'm not. I appreciate Ella and mountains and lakes and all. But as I said, I'm more interested in the people like
Yes.
Stella Solomon. She's
Yes.
incredible.
Tell us about Estelle Solomon. Solomon.
Estella sought out the typical blues. Oh, this is for Donegal. Estella sought out the typical blues and modes in Donegal, where she visited A.E. in his very house. And one of her paintings is a gay day in Donegal in 1915. They're selling for thousands of pounds now.
I don't have a copy of that one.
Oh, you're funny. Now, it's there she developed her sense of colour. She was to return to Donegal repeatedly. A.E., George Russell, was already there, painting the more settled area around Marble Hill Bay. But Estella Solomon was drawn to the wild headlands and depths of the sea. Her manner was rapid and expressionist, using wedges of gleaming colour with brilliant highlights. The whole view is vivacious, full of moving sea, shifting light and clouds, capturing the essence of a sunny day on the Donegal coast. This is a meeting with Standish.
Oh yeah, that was the other thing I wanted to get to. That
Stella's
A.E. introduced Ella to Standish. Is
No,
that
it's,
right?
no. Stella's studio was the top. She top of the tall building at number 17 Brunswick Street, and she spent a good deal of time on the roof. A young girl who had read Insurrections asked Bethel Solomon, that's her brother, to introduce her to the author. And she waited with Estella on the roof, trembling with excitement, expecting James Stephens to be a tall, aesthetic man with flowing locks, or at least to be poetic in type, and of a certain stature. A leprechaun leapt onto the roof. Ah, Jesus, that look, he said, not looking at the girl at all. Isn't the air full of jizz? Thus was a dream destroyed. James lived in a flat below Stella's studio, and they struck up a very close relationship. After learning Irish in '02, Ella visited Atherland in '03 to collect folklore for her friend George Russell.
Wait, so she first collected the folklore for AE? Or is that why she first went?
In '03.
In 03?
Yeah.
And
So,
she learned Irish to go and collect
Indeed,
it.
Scholastic, yeah.
so she was initially doing her life's work
Of course.
to share these stories with
It's
AE.
not AE with
Yeah,
the world.
Well, I mean, eventually, but.
Yeah, like
but-
Estella,
okay.
like Estella, I've got a great affinity with women, with
Mm,
artists.
mhm.
Men, they're okay. I'm joking. Ella was, after learning art, what I said there, like Estella, she stored ammunitions at her home. Ella was opposed to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, as a result of which she never spoke to AE again. But that's not quite true. But she left.
Okay, but before we get to the end of their friendship, if that really ended.
No, I think
I
they're
wanted to
both
talk.
disillusioned with the Catholic Church.
Oh, yeah,
And
well,
dead.
yes.
Yeah.
Do you wanna, we could talk a little bit about that story about how Standish got an assignment from the train company. She tells a story of how the train company was trying to get more people to buy train tickets to Connemara, and no one would go out there. So they hired Standish to write a pamphlet or something about how great the destination of
Now,
that
Mrs.
large
O'Grady,
train ride.
Margaret O'Grady was a psychic. She was amazing.
Okay, all right, but before we get into the psychicness, so he didn't want to do the job, so he sent his wife and his wife's friend, Ella Young, out to Connemara to do the job instead,
First glimpse of the West.
right? So do I have the story right so far?
Enter Mrs. O'Grady, flourishing 2 scraps of paper. We're going to Connemara, you and I. What has happened, I inquired. Well, the Western Railway Company wants Standish to give the country a write-up. They offered 2 tickets. Of course, Standish wouldn't write it up, so word write, and you can write it up. I'll write it up, said I. We started. Our ticket struck us everywhere that the railway went, and franked us along the famous drives where the railway didn't go. How splendid to be going west to Gaelic Ireland, to the unspoiled, beautiful west. The trees grew smaller, the grass sparser. The little fields had stone walls around them. One passed sedgy lakes, all bright with water lilies. It is true, the little train with its self-important panting engine loitered. It had a pleasant sense of taking its time. It stopped for the engine driver to light his pipe in a cottage and have a talk with a friend. On one occasion, it slowed up to let an old mother goose and her goslings get on for the way. Mrs. O'Grady was much amused, but while I sat there to write the kind of article that would please the railway company, she edited a letter to Standish in which she described and embellished these happenings. Standish was delighted. He much preferred it to my article. To please the railway company, he published mine. To please himself, he published hers. Unfortunately, the railway company studied the copy of the All Ireland Review that he had sent them and came across Mrs. O'Grady's letter. As a result, while we were sunning ourselves in Acker, a lament arrived from Standish, the attitude of humanity. That railway company had sent a young man to demand an interview and tell Standish what the company thought about it. The young man surprised an interview. I am glad he did, said Mrs. O'Grady. I'm glad that Standish had to listen to what the company thought. Perhaps it will make him careful. It will make the railway company careful, I said. You'll never get another ticket. We never did. And how the wind and sea welcomed us on the mountains deploying in companies. What joy we had of the wide boglands stretching to wider skies. What colour there was of greenness in the sparse grass. What splendour of orange in tangled sea wreck caught among the ancient granite grey boulders. My first glimpse of the West. My first experience of an enchantment that has held me all my life. those little lakes with the sedges, those unplougable bogs, those untillable mountains, those wind-blown trees, those reaches of sand where the waves lap and make a song for the seabirds, lowly, untrodden reaches by the sea. How well I remember them. How well I remember the stone-walled cottages, so securely thatched, the generous fireplace, with its ingle nook, the rapture scene, the stories by the smouldering turf songs, the dawns, sunsets, and the unbelievable. There's another.
I love that story.
Yeah.
You know, how different her career would have been if he hadn't have bossed up that gig, and she could have had free train rides, you know, for the rest of her life, but instead,
This is another one of Standish here, the portrait, yeah.
do you want to hear another reading from?
Maybe.
Maybe we should wind up, because I just want to talk a little bit about the end of their friendship, because I first thought that they broke up because of their differences over the Civil War, but now that I've been listening to stories, no, about the Civil War, about the treaty.
forming of the, yeah,
The treaty.
yeah.
Was that the right way to say it, or should I say it in a different way?
Partition, I think.
Partition,
Partition, yeah.
okay. All right, I'll say it that way. But maybe they had just already kind of grown apart. What do you think?
I think. God knows.
Because, you know, she was in California when he came to California.
I know, yeah, that was in 32, but he was very sick and
Yeah.
she didn't meet him.
Yeah, they didn't meet up. I guess I would just like to think that they didn't fall out. You know, I guess I'm just going to use my own imagination and say that, you know, like they've been friends for 20 years, and sometimes they just,
People
yeah,
fall in and out of
Yeah.
friendship.
but not us. And just to conclude, I feel like AE's my friend now, just like, you know, you were saying that you don't have to be in the same room, and I got stuck into this AE club kind of by accident, and now I'm here for the people. I'm here for the friends, like you, Dorothy.
Oh, well, I wouldn't be as energetic as you, Linda. It wouldn't be possible.
Thank you very much, that's